The first pay-per-view of 2024 for the UFC went off on Saturday in Toronto, UFC 297, and a middleweight championship in the main event. I'm Brian Campbell, here to break down the action that we just saw in a new era of sorts atop the division as Dricus du Plessis edges out Sean Strickland by split decision in that main event to cap off a very uneven card for the UFC as they went back to Toronto for the first time in 5 years. In the main event, though, we saw a tense slugfest chess match of sorts that really seemed to pick up steam late. But for the most part, it was technical and at a high pace as the defense of Sean Strickland and the heavy jab made things difficult for du Plessis. But ultimately, the three judges were split. 48-47 were the scores of all three, two of them going to du Plessis, mostly due to a swing round three that really could have gone either way. But as I mentioned, this was an intense striking battle back and forth as both fighters were cut. Both fighters had swelling around the eyes, including du Plessis after round two, which looked like it could go in a rough direction for him. But he's able to hold that off, get inside the jab of Strickland, and really make things happen with looping punches. But ultimately, it seemed to be the takedowns that was the difference for du Plessis, slamming Strickland down in round one, aiming to add at least one per round the rest of the way. And in a very close fight, it ultimately came down to the gas tank as well, as du Plessis, known for his knockout punch, and he certainly looked to deliver that on this one, really had to show all the tools in his tool bag. And if you look at the rise of DDP in the UFC as he improves to 7-0 with 5 stoppages, although this one did go the distance, what we've seen out of the new champion in the last 2 fights specifically have been a huge evolution, not just upsetting former champion Robert Whittaker last year and raising his game and really his technical prowess, along with, of course, that knockdown and the takedown threat that he brings. But when you've got a fighter that big, that dangerous, who can show you a complete game like he did against Strickland, being forced to constantly make adjustments, having his calf kick strategy taken away very early by Strickland's constant checking of those kicks, you saw DDP have to dig into the playbook, dig into the bag of tricks. And ultimately, he pulled it off. Really, as I mentioned, could have gone either way. Technically, I did score the fight for Strickland, giving him just barely that swing round three. But the reason why I enjoyed DDP getting his hand raised, because he was the fighter that really brought it more in that final round and pushed that pace. And many others on social media seem to possibly have him ahead. Either way, a new start to this division, and the first title fight at 185 pounds, not involving Whittaker or another former champion, Israel Adesanya. You have to go back to 2017, UFC 217. And of course, George St. Pierre's comeback after a five-year retirement to defeat Michael Bisping. That's the last time we didn't see Whittaker or Adesanya. Could we see Adesanya next? If you're DDP, that's what he asked for immediately after the fight, telling Adesanya to get his stuff together, get back in the octagon, maybe a little play on words from the famous Daniel Cormier to John Jones call out. But for Adesanya, who was upset by Strickland in the same manner as Whittaker last year, does he have what it takes to come back here? There was some reports that he would be cage side in Toronto. We didn't ultimately see that happen, but it's an interesting middleweight division, one that really could be the division in the UFC in 2024 when you consider those who are coming up the ranks right behind the new champion. And that's, of course, the likes of Khamzat Chimaev, bright, huge prospects like Bo Nickel, who will be back at UFC 300, Joe Pyfer. A lot of turnover here in this division, but you got to give DDP credit for what he was able to do. Strickland is not an easy out in any circumstance, especially since he himself has seemed to raise his game over the past year. We know he brings that big gas tank himself, the toughness, and you have to give Strickland credit for standing in there under some huge shots from du Plessis. But it's one and done for Sean Strickland, who had a very interesting, let's say, controversial week that, of course, dates back to Wednesday's media day, which really got a lot of the news cycle going for this. Luckily, though, it was really just about the fights in this case, and all that bad blood and hatred between the two that really became more of the attention grabber than the potential matchup itself. Luckily, respect and honor seemed to win out between these two, and really they both earned that respect and honor with their performances. Could have gone either way. Enjoyed to see DDP get that edge because he did seem to land the bigger punches throughout, and when you add in that wrestling prowess, it was just enough. And if the middleweight championship bout was a sort of high point on this night, it was certainly necessary to avoid all things disaster when you look back on this card. A card that brought the UFC back to Toronto, one of its longtime hotbeds for the first time since long before the pandemic in 2018. What we had here was a fight card that was filled with Canadians. You had a raucous crowd early, but specifically the male Canadian fighters, one by one, were able to find defeat, none of them getting their hand raised ultimately on this night. But once we got to the co-main event and the vacant women's bantamweight title fight, the boos came down, the momentum, if there was any, was halted, and really what can only be described as one of the worst championship fights in UFC history on paper turned into arguably the worst championship fight we've seen in a long time inside the cage, as longtime veteran Raquel Pennington, who came in with the division's longest win streak at 5, was able to extend that to 6 and win a championship in her second title shot at this weight class against Mayra Bueno Silva. But just wording it like that doesn't tell the full story of the fight. Of course, this fight came in much maligned in the aftermath of Amanda Nunes, the greatest female fighter of all time universally, dropping her 2 belts out of nowhere last year after defeating Irene Aldana in a bantamweight title defense. It took the UFC nearly a full year to find the plans for the future. But with Juliana Pena, the former champion, not yet ready to come back and compete, we saw Pennington versus Bueno Silva. You saw a lot of people lower their expectations coming in a fight that on paper, as I mentioned, didn't look to be championship worthy. Unfortunately, even though Pennington prevailed in this one and showed the better gas tank and showed really more toughness throughout, it was hard to be excited about the future of the women's bantamweight division. It was hard to be excited about the start of Pennington's title reign. It's really hard to circle necessarily on her as, let's say, the sole issues of why this fight caused so much booing from the crowd, caused so much derision on social media. In fact, Pennington, while getting the title put around her waist, was really getting showered in boos from the crowd as Dana White put the title belt on her. She deserves a lot of the issues, but even more of it should go to Mayra Bueno Silva. Came in there talking a lot of trash about how much better she was against Pennington on paper, and the fact that Bueno Silva felt she should be fighting Juliana Pena for the title. Well, she's not going to get that chance because she gassed out nearly disastrously, going the distance in the end, but nearly succumbing to the submission and ground and pound attempts from Pennington in round 5. And to be honest, with this fight in the balance heading into round 5, we saw Mayra Bueno Silva, who 2 rounds before that looked like she was close to gassing out, and was really only able to do just that, survive down the stretch as she was taken down early, seemed to be a clear 10-8 round, dominated from start to finish. It was the choices of Pennington in key moments and maybe the lack of necessary fight IQ that really in some ways made her lucky to win the fight. Not that she didn't deserve it when you look at the totality of what happened in it, but it took a collapse for Mayra Bueno Silva to open up that door. And Pennington had a lot of moments where you questioned, why was she going back to the clinch so easily, yet her corner was imploring her to stay away from that when she was having more success striking on the feet? And why so many times did this fight have just questionable decisions from both? UFC certainly in a tough spot without the star power of old, with Nunes gone in this division that Ronda Rousey started. Holly Holm, an aging former champion, Miesha Tate, an aging former champion, not really in the mix right now. But really the result of this fight over 5 rounds put almost a bad stain on the card, and certainly a bad taste in the mouth of anyone looking forward to any future title fights in this division. Yes, Raquel Pennington in her second chance is a world champion, but as bad as it feels to see a newly crowned champion booed as lustfully as Pennington was, it's almost as if this is the type of fight where the belt could have stayed vacant afterwards, or maybe shouldn't have been matched to begin with, given the collective lack of star power between the two, and truly, honestly, the lack of plus ability to both. It's dark times at 135 pounds in the women, maybe nearly as dark as it is at 145 pounds, where Nunes also gave up her title last year. Yet we haven't heard any rumbling from the UFC if that division will continue. Tough going on that. And then the fight came directly after a key mid-card fight on this pay-per-view offering between Neil Magny and Canadian favorite Mike Malott at welterweight. Malott came in there as maybe the biggest crowd favorite of the night, outside of the crowd pop Sean Strickland had coming in after some of the talk he had at the press conference this week to the Canadian fans, although Dricus du Plessis was getting the cheers down the stretch. But for all the talk of Mike Malott coming in, having won 6 straight, all by stoppage since he took 4 years off of the sport, and being unbeaten in the octagon, and maybe the future of this welterweight division, could he beat a Neil Magny and catapult himself into the top 10? For 2+ rounds, it looked like Mike Malott was that guy. Aggressive calf kicks attempts on Magny, butchered him up in the first round. Then Malott took the fight to the ground in round 2, was shifting to full mount with ease and looking like he was close to raining down enough ground and pound to end the fight. But when it got to the third and Magny was able to make a key adjustment to get top position of his own and eventually full mount, the gas tank of Malott disastrously fell apart. For a 32-year-old looking to make his splash with maybe not a lot of time left when you consider the division he's in and where he's at, this is a tough setback that he's going to have to go back to the drawing board and really fix this hole of cardio if he intends to one day be on the championship level, because 2.5 rounds in, he had nothing left, was almost able to make it to the finish with Magny on top of him, but with 15 seconds left in the fight, finally was unable to defend the strikes coming in, and the fight was stopped. That was certainly a disappointing ending for the fans and a bright prospect right here. But the 36-year-old Magny, leaning on his veteran ways with that gas tank that'll never quit, was able to get his hand raised. The other fight of note before we close here was the kickoff on the main card between two highly ranked featherweights, and a spot really could open up for the winner a chance to directly insert himself into the title discussion. Movsar Evloev stayed unbeaten in the end with a hard-fought unanimous decision over Arnold Allen, a fight that really afterwards felt like it could have gone either way, considering how close round 1 and 3 were. You could have leaned Allen in either of those, but all 3 judges ended up giving Evloev rounds 2 and 3 in the end. Excuse me, rounds 1 and 2, giving that close round 1 to Evloev, even though Allen was able to rally in round 3. And of course, he had the multiple knees to the grounded opponent as Evloev was playing the up and down game with his hand, was getting lifted up by those knees, which seemed to make them borderline legal upon replay. Good call from referee Mark Goddard, though, to not take away a point from Allen and keep him in the fight. But the judges ultimately preferred Evloev, who came in there jacked as all heck, and maybe first team all bod if we go that way, talking about the UFC, but a guy who looks like a future title contender. Doesn't always have the most exciting style, but he really wanted to break that recent streak of 6 straight decisions in the UFC and get his first stoppage. Wasn't able to get that despite dropping Allen, but he really showed out, even overcoming a bad cut on his left eye that compromised his vision. Evloev taking a step forward, and a tough loss for Allen, who just had his first UFC defeat up against Max Holloway last time out in a fight that was close and really showed that Allen seemed to be ready for the elite. He didn't start quick enough in that fight, and I think you can argue the same in this one, with that late rally being not enough. All in all, a weird night for UFC 297 as UFC kicks off its 2024 campaign on the pay-per-view level. But good storylines in that middleweight division, and a new championship on top, or new champion, excuse me, and Dricus du Plessis as South Africa has their own champ. And what could we see in the future of this 185-pound division? We'll have to wait and see. I'm Brian Campbell, CBS Sports. You can catch me on Morning Combat. But until then, we're out of here.